So it's incredibly cool to be back in Britain. I spent 3 of the happiest years until I had my kids here in Britain. It was different then, but it's wonderful to be back, even though it's only 48 hours that I will be here. But I wouldn't have come for 48 hours to be here except to talk to a group like this, a group that has been a leader in defining what freedom in the internet should be. And I'm grateful for the chance to help in the conversation about what freedom in the internet should be. But I want to start with 3 policy areas to get a perspective on what has been the history so far. So let's start with spectrum. All across the world, this idea of spectrum is regulated. It's regulated by the governments because the government said it had to be regulated by the government. Justice Murphy in 1946 put it like this: owing to its physical characteristics, radio, unlike the other methods of conveying information, must be regulated and rationed by the government. Otherwise, there would be chaos and radio's usefulness would be largely destroyed. So it's physics that gave us the Politburo over the radio regulation, or the FCC. It's very much the same thing. And the FCC then gave us this incredibly complicated scheme of allocated spectrum. Spectrum allocated by judgments by government bodies about whose use of the spectrum was best. And then about 13 years later, this man, future Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase, looked at the same issue and he thought the problem could be resolved differently. Rather than allocating spectrum, Coase said, this is like any other resource in the world. There ought to be owners of those resources. Spectrum should be a kind of property, and we should auction off that property to different possible owners so that they could then utilize it to the best extent they knew how. And in my view, there is no doubt that Coase's view is much better, assuming this is the way in which we're using spectrum. Loud broadcasts across large territories, Coase was right. Assuming this as the model, Coase was right. But about 20 years before Coase had his Nobel Prize winning insight, another incredibly important inventor from the 20th century, Hedy Lamarr, was having her own brilliant insight about how, or we would understand it was an insight about how spectrum could be allocated. She recognized there was a different way for spectrum to be allocated, what would eventually be understood as a kind of shared spectrum model or a spectrum commons, a way to allow people to share the same spectrum space efficiently and effectively. And that under that model, there was no reason to license, there was no reason to own spectrum. All that there was necessary here was the allocation to enable people to use it. Now, how would that work? Well, about a decade ago, when people were talking about this intensely, people like Yochai Benkler and others forcing the world to recognize this alternative mode of spectrum, it's a little bit hard for people to understand how that could be possible. But today, it's completely obvious to everyone. Because this model of spectrum, this model of shared spectrum, where people can actually operate simultaneously different uses of the spectrum in the same space, is exactly the model for how Wi-Fi functions in this room right now. Rather than regulators, code figures out how to share this space efficiently. Code, in this sense, was law. And in that sense, we could allocate this resource to make it possible for people to share without cops or sheriffs assuring exclusive use to anyone. And some of the people thinking about this problem, David Reed, who was at the very birth of the internet, one of the people responsible for the way in which TCP/IP was originally architected, some of these people believe, in fact, if this model were embraced fully, it could produce the extraordinary consequence that as more users used spectrum, we could increase the capacity of the spectrum. More users wouldn't produce scarcity, it would produce plenty. Now, a decade ago, when I wrote this book, Future of Ideas, no one really knew whether Reed was right. Nobody really knew which of these models was best. And so in that world, the ideal way to deal with what you don't know was experimentation. Let's try these three models, Stalin, Coase, and Hedy Lamarr. Let's play them off against each other. Let's experiment to see which one is going to work best. And the conventional wisdom circa 2001 was that experimentation was the mode governments should adopt. We should deploy lots more unlicensed spectrum. We should experiment with lots more auctions of spectrum. And then let's count the economic returns and the social returns that come from each of these different kinds of uses. Now, toggle ahead 10 or 11 years. Have we seen a decade of experimentation? No, we haven't. The conventional wisdom today is this, that the property model is presumptively the right model, and Hedy Lamarr was just an actress, and Stalin is finally dead. There is no current extraordinary energy and excitement around this idea of spectrum commons anymore because that idea has been pushed to the side. And it hasn't been pushed to the side by lots of researchers or engineers or independent policy analysts who've come to the conclusion that David Reed was wrong. It's been pushed to the side in the way this cockroach has been pushed to the side, as millions of lobbyists around the world have increasingly convinced our governments that only one model makes sense. Because who's going to make money in a world of free spectrum? How can anybody, the telecoms or the cable companies or anybody in the business of buying spectrum make money in a world where spectrum is free? So unfree spectrum is the new normal. Ideas be damned, evidence be damned. Good public policy now embraces the ideas of Coase and rejects the ideas of the founders of the internet. And why is that? Because of the endless money that has been spewed on this policy question around the world by those who benefit from the model of scarcity. Or think about broadband. This is a technical term, it's a legal technical term, I apologize for this, but broadband in the United States sucks. Any number of measures, here's where the United States stands on broadband, here's Britain a little bit better, and the winner countries are not like, Korea, the winner countries include France. Now, how could it be that France beats the United States and Britain in broadband? But the fact is, there are radical differences in the capacity and speed of broadband around the world, and that difference is explained, as Benkler and his Berkman crew showed, by differences in government policy. Now, to say it sucks is to say it sucks on average, and states differ in the United States pretty dramatically. This state, North Carolina, is a particularly bad state. It is the worst state in the nation for broadband access. Despite this fact that Red Hat and the Research Triangle and Duke and UNC are there in North Carolina, it is still the worst. And in both cases then, the United States and in North Carolina, we should ask the question, why is it so bad? And in both cases, there's a simple answer, and the answer is the same: monopoly power. There's little competition, poor competition, in some places no competition, and what little no competition yields is sucky broadband. And the solution is competition. Now, policymakers early in the history of the internet got this. In 1996, they passed the Telecommunications Act, and it embraced an idea of open access to facilitate competition in the United States in the access that one would get on cable and telecom. Well, actually, not cable. There was a compromise. There would be open access here, meaning at the head end, competitors got the right to serve you DSL service, while cable providers had an exclusive right to provide DSL service. Now, that policy was fought pretty strongly by the DSL providers. They didn't like the fact that they had to face competition. And by 2000, when the administration shifted to the administration of George Bush, that policy changed. So instead of there being open access in at least one channel, there was no open access in any channels in broadband in the United States, and competition among broadband providers died. And the response has been to scurry across the country for alternatives, ways to make it so broadband doesn't suck. And North Carolina, among many states, has come up with an interesting alternative. Communities in North Carolina have begun to adopt a strategy to build out their own broadband. You know, they build roads, they build streetlights, they provide schools. They think, let's build broadband. It's infrastructure, we'll build it, and we'll make it so that we can enter the 21st century like the rest of America, like France, for God's sake, and not like the rest of North Carolina. And so in the first data reports about this, it was pretty astonishing, the differences. So if you look at these bubbles at the bottom, the size of the bubble is basically the cost per month, and the height and the distance from the axis, the origin here, is the speed. Download is on the bottom and upload is on the top. What this is saying is that Time Warner and AT&T provide sucky broadband service. But these community broadband services provide extraordinary broadband, competitive with anything in the world, just as good as anything in the world, because they have a different model for providing broadband access. That was the response of communities in the United States. What was the response to the response? Well, 19 states have now passed legislation like this. You know, it's dangerous when it says leveling playing field, Local Government Competition Act. Leveling the playing field means that this competition against the incumbent private providers will be blocked by government law. Basically, it's illegal for communities to provide broadband service in competition with the broadband providers in the United States. The Republicans passed this in the North Carolina legislature, and then there was a huge campaign to get the Democratic governor to veto it, to veto this bill H129. There were thousands of calls to the governor's office, resolutions by communities all across the state, Republican communities as well as Democratic communities. What was the result? Well, the governor was given the bill on the 10th of May last year, and without her signature, it became law on the 21st of May because she didn't want to stand up to the power of these incumbents. So what she said was, there is a need to establish rules to prevent cities and towns from having an unfair advantage over providers in the private sector. An unfair advantage? Could it be unfair to recognize that you have sucky broadband and you need to do something about it in the 20th century, 21st century? Could it be unfair to actually adopt policies to respond to that, to defend against that, to provide access to the internet for your citizens? Could that be unfair? And if that's unfair, are streetlights unfair? Are highways unfair? Is this the quintessential example of unfairness here in the middle of the UK as government-provided services compete with all those private bridge builders who might be in the business of building bridges across the Thames? No! There's no unfairness here. This is infrastructure like the internet. And what we know from theorists who aren't paid by AT&T or Verizon is that there is public support essential for building this infrastructure. Not exclusively, but support is essential. So the unfairness here is absurd. And if it's not this absurd claim, then what explains this absurd law? Well, just last week, the State Institute that studies money in state politics published a report that said that legislators who received money from telecom companies and voted for the blocking of community broadband received 76% more money than those who opposed it, and legislative leaders who supported it got 5 times the amount of money from those interests as those who supported it. Okay, one last answer, one last problem. Copyright. I don't really need to spend much time talking about copyright, right? Copyright is, of course, a focus of the energy of this organization and many people in this room for a very long time. And as we look at kind of a sanity measure in the copyright debate, it's interesting how there's a period of time where the sanity of the public and the government's about the same, but then at a certain point, the government's sanity level starts falling dramatically, while the public sanity level is actually going up. The public is getting it. The public is much more responsive, receptive to the ideas of good policy in this space, while the government is becoming crazier and crazier. And we should be proud of that. It is because of the activism, not the government part, the public part. It is because of the activism of organizations like the EFF or the Open Rights Group or the Free Software Foundation or Public Knowledge. It struck me as I looked at this, there's something about the red color here. And I think it's really bad to associate too hard with the reds here, so that's why Creative Commons is green. But anyway, there is this very important success we can report about how the work of these many organizations has got the world to understand why the insanity insisted upon by the monopolists is pure insanity. Now that movement towards sanity, I think, begins around October 27th, 1998, when our Congress passes a law in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, a statute which extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question that Congress was supposed to be asking as it passed this statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright by 20 years? We took this case to the Supreme Court and challenged the statute. We created a brief signed by a bunch of economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this left-wing, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said he would join the brief saying that this could not advance the public good only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that extending the term of an existing copyright could not advance the public good. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyright. What there was more than $6 million in financial support from Disney and related interests who wanted their copyrights extended, the public good be damned. Now that statute and many more increasingly woke America up, America the people, not America the government, until we had the extraordinary response to the latest rounds of craziness in the SOPA PIPA debate. Now, what explains the craziness? Not the sanity, but the craziness. Because through this 15 years, every single point in the intellectual argument had been made many, many years before, yet the insanity continued. Indeed, not just continued, it got even worse. The more time went on, the clearer it was among policymakers that all of this policy was crazy, the crazier the government got. The more they rallied to the rhetoric of Jack Valenti, the former head of the Motion Picture Association, who said that he considered the war on piracy his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. So what explains all of that insanity? Once again, the same explanation, the extraordinary amount of money that's pushed into the system, at least in the United States, by copyright interests. Now, in all 3 cases, what do these stories have in common? They have in common this feature, or this feature, or this feature. And I want to do a footnote here. I found this really beautiful gold at this site I'd never seen before, this really great site called Compfight. So it's like a Google image search, except it does Creative Commons licensing options. So you can click a Creative Commons licensing option, you can see Creative Commons licenses image, and then on the side it has iStock photo images. So it's an extraordinary tool for beginning to do the kind of free culture work that all of us are doing. Okay, advertisements for a group I have nothing to do with, finished. Back to the story. Gold. Gold on the table explains the craziness we've seen, and that gold leads into these endless wars. These endless wars of attrition that they fight because they know we'll get bored and we'll move on. And so the critical question we've got to ask is, how do we fight against the endless warrior? Against the warrior who will continue to wage his losing war until all of us have lost? Well, I think there's a simple answer to this. Simple answer is, you've got to be smart. I don't mean smart in a kind of Einstein way. I mean smart in a kind of Cory Doctorow way. I mean, smart in the way you British people would say, kind of clever or deviously clever. And I want to suggest 3 deviously clever strategies we in this movement need to adopt if we're going to answer this war waged by those who are willing to wage endless war. 3 answers. Number 1, we need to build better understanding. Okay, so copyright is a regulation. It's a regulation by the state. It's intended to change a regulation that would have been produced by the market without copyright. It's an exclusive right, a monopoly right, a property right, necessary to solve an inevitable market failure. What economists say when they say there's not enough incentives to produce certain kinds of creative work. Now, I'm very conventional. I'm pro-copyright in this sense. Even in the digital age, especially in the digital age, I think copyright in its proper form is necessary. But the internet has inspired this extraordinary fight around copyright, fight around the artist's right as it affects copyright, music in particular. As people have engaged in massive sharing, behavior which courts across the world have deemed to be illegally. Sharing which has been fought by the artists, or actually the artists' representatives. Now, all of us have been engaged in this challenge to that battle against this, quote, sharing. We challenged it, they defended it. But if you can get above the din of that fight, in a certain sense, important parts of both sides in this battle acknowledge that some form of copyright here is essential. That certain creative work needs copyright. For that creative work, copyright is essential. But distinct from that copyrighted work where copyright is essential, we need to recognize that copyright is also relied upon not only by artists, it's also relied upon by publishers too. And publishers are a different animal from artists. As Milton put it, they are old patentees and monopolizers in the trade of bookselling, men who do not labor in an honest profession. To them, learning is indebted. That's who publishers were in England, at least, in the time Milton was writing about them. But we can at least say publishers are different. The economic problems that publishers have are different from the economic problems that an artist or a creator has. So if we have these 2 different entities relying on copyright, who was copyright for? Well, when the Statute of Anne, birthed here, created copyright, it was ambiguous. And in 1769, in the very first case to address it, it made it sound as if copyright was actually for the publishers. But in 1774, in a case inspired by the fight over whether this book would be free to Scottish publishers to release, the House of Lords reversed the earlier case and declared that copyright was limited in Britain and therefore free culture in Britain was born. Copyright was not for publishers. Even if it benefits publishers, it's a creative right, an author's right. Even if it benefits publishers, copyright is for authors. Now, I remark these obvious borders because I think we forget it too often. We've been fighting the battle where copyright is essential, and we've paid too little attention to the battle where copyright is not essential, where it's not important. For example, in the context of science. So I was paging through my Harvard Gazette last year, and I came across this article about this new economist at Harvard. And she's commenting about how wonderful Harvard is, and everything's great at Harvard. And the question asked to her was, well, why are your shelves empty? She had no books on her shelves. To which the obvious answer was, I'm an economist, but she didn't want to say that. So instead what she said was, the shelves are empty because everything I need is on the internet now. Well, let's think about that statement, everything is on the internet now. What does that mean? I ran a little test of this claim. I've been doing studies in the area of corruption, So I went to Google Scholar and I typed in the phrase campaign finance. And here's the top list of articles about campaign finance. And so I started paging through these articles to see whether I could read them. So I went to the first one. I discovered that it was protected by Heinlein. I was going to have to pay to get access to it, $29.95. I went to the second one. Discovered it was protected by JSTOR. I was going to have to get access in an undetermined way from JSTOR. The third one, once again, Heinlein, $29.95. The fourth one, Questia. I could get a free one-day trial from Questia. Of course, if I subscribed to a yearly subscription of 69 euros, but that was the way I could get access to that work. This one, once again, protected by JSTOR. 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 This one, too, protected by JSTOR. This one by Heinlein. So how accessible is this work? The top 10 articles in the area of campaign finance reform. Well, one of them was free, one time only. One of them I had to pay $10 for, 3 of them $29.95, and 5 of them, the terms were unknown because JSTOR wouldn't reveal the terms in the context of my accessing them. So when this professor says everything is on the internet now, what does she mean? She means if, it's a big if, I promise, if you're a tenured professor at an elite university, or maybe a professor, or maybe students and professors, maybe not just elite, maybe at all universities, whatever. The point is, if you are a member of the knowledge elite, then you have free access. But the rest of the world, not so much. Now, we should look at that and say, that's outrageous. Hillary Clinton said it was outrageous. Here. It's outrageous. And it's outrageous because we built this world. We academics built this world. This system of blocked access flows from choices that we make about copyright, choices that we make about the deployment of copyright, that we allow to be made about the deployment of our copyright. But the point is here, copyright is being used to benefit publishers, not to enable authors. There is not one of the authors in this list of the top 10 articles about campaign finance reform who gets any money from copyright from their articles. Not one of them wants the distribution of their articles limited. Not one of them has a business model based upon restriction. Not one should support this system. As a knowledge policy, for the creators here, this is crazy. And the craziness does not stop here. So about 2.5 years ago, the most incredible girl in the world was born. She's also my daughter. But my daughter was born, and soon after she was born, the doctors warned us there was a danger she had jaundice. So being an obsessive academic type, I went and I downloaded every single article I could about jaundice. And I was measuring as I did this, because I wanted to distract myself, how much it would have cost if I had not been a member of the knowledge elite to get the articles I gathered here. It would have been $435 for an ordinary person to get the information about jaundice that might be affecting their child. But for me, it was free. Okay. So I download all these articles, and her condition gets worse and worse. And one night, in the middle of the night, we try to wake her up, and she's completely lethargic. And we call the doctor, and the doctor says, you have to get her to the hospital immediately. So I bundle her up, and I race to the hospital. And she's sitting next to me in the crib, in the carrying case, and I got to distract myself. I'm terrified. So I, of course, have brought the articles with me. Now it's time to read them. So I pull out this one, and this is a really great article published in this great journal, which makes most of its work available for free. And I get to the place where it says, here's how you can know whether there's something really dangerous here. It's going to be a chart. So I turn the page to get to the chart, and this is what I get. The rights holder did not grant rights to reproduce this item in electronic media. For the missing article, see the original print version of this publication. And I was astonished, relieved in a certain sense, because I wasn't thinking about the craziness that was afflicting my daughter. I was thinking about the craziness that was afflicting our culture to the access of scientific knowledge. How could it possibly make sense to be regulating the access to parts of articles here? What could possibly have gotten into anybody's head when they said, yes, we should set up a system where we can be licensing access to the articles, but we'll separately license access to the graphs in the middle of the articles? Now the point is, here and throughout, in the increasing architecture of access to knowledge, which is the digital world, we're building an architecture for access in the context of Google Books and others, where we're exercising perfect control down to the period. This is, again, technically insane. We are architecting access to knowledge here to maximize revenue. And why are we doing that? Is it revenue to the authors, to the creators? Is it a restriction necessary for the incentives to create the sort of restriction copyright was supposed to be about? Does this limitation serve any of the original purpose of copyright? The answer to that is no. It is a natural result of the difference between for-profit companies and not-for-profit companies, and a product, a good, that we all must have. You can see the consequence of that in this extraordinary study that was published about 2004, where they tried to measure the costs for for-profit journals and not-for-profit journals. And the cost per page of a for-profit journal is 4.5 times the cost per page of a not-for-profit journal. And the cost per citation is 9.2 times the cost of a citation in a not-for-profit journal. Now you look at that difference and say, why would that be? Are the for-profit journals less efficient? And the answer is no. They're probably more efficient. The difference between the for-profit and the not-for-profit journals is different in the functions they are trying to serve. The for-profit journals are trying to maximize their profit. That's what they're in business for. The not-for-profit journals are in the business of providing access to scientific knowledge. Their interest is not in extracting as much rent as they possibly can from the public. It's in making sure that the work is spread broadly. And the consequences of shifting more and more of this work into for-profit journals that make this calculation and give access according to what the market will bear is this difference. Okay, by the way, the kid was fine. She didn't have jaundice. Everything was all right with that problem. Okay, now, when I say we need first a better understanding, what I mean is we need to see the opportunity of focusing the public on this fact, because it shows us better how to resist the extremism here. It shows us where to resist. There is in this story a natural resistor. It is not the pirate. It is the author. It is the creator. It is the scientist. It's the teacher. These creators can admit there's a role for copyright. It's not just the role of copyright über alles, right? And we can recruit them to this fight if we show them this important difference between the arguable need of copyright in the context of artists producing music and the completely unnecessary use of exclusive access to work in the context of scientific knowledge. Now, it's that insight that was the inspiration behind what we built with Creative Commons. It's that insight that has inspired the open access movement. In part, that was inspired by the cost. So here's the inflation rate over this period going through 2005. Here's the price rise in journal costs. So as technology is ostensibly making everything cheaper, the costs are going up. And it's also been inspired by certain unfairness, right? These are all journals, well, there are peer reviews. We do all the work, they get all the money. So the response to these two concerns, cost and unfairness, has been open access publishing. And what we need here is more resistors, more in the scientific and education space to demand this. Now, historically, we've seen very important resistors in this story. Pat Brown and Mike Eisen, two scientists in the Bay Area, got together to build the Public Library of Science, which makes scientific work universally accessible for free under the freest of the Creative Commons licenses. We've seen here in this part of the world, too, people pushing in this space strongly to release and support the free release of this work powerfully. My recent hero from this work, though, is the Cambridge mathematician Tim Gowers. Earlier in this year, Gowers posted on his weblog his resolve never to publish in an Elsevier publication again because of the outrageousness of the cost to get access to his scientific work. That then inspired a colleague in the Bay to start this cost of knowledge site, which now has about 8,750 different scientists from around the world who have joined the boycott of Elsevier until Elsevier changes their policies. And what these changes do is they point to the people we need to bring into this battle, the academy. To say to the academy, recognize your ethical obligation. You're in the business of producing universal access to knowledge. And that obligation entails keeping your work free. This is an ethical point, and we don't need exclusivity. We don't need and shouldn't practice exclusivity, and we should name those who do wrong. Those who do are not living up to the ideals that should mark us as scholars. Okay, you're supposed to applaud now. Okay, so the second of the three things we need to do to be Cory-Doctorow smart is we have to be more strategic here. So think about the recent battle about the extension of copyright term. Britain has actually been pretty good in the debate around this particular issue. Astonishingly, two governments, both a Labour government and a Conservative government, have commissioned reports, both of which very strongly concluded that the extension of existing works made no sense. Now, you might say, how hard could it be if a Nobel Prize winner says it's a no-brainer? But it was a pretty important conclusion for these government reports to conclude, and Britain should be proud of standing clear about this in a government-sponsored report. But the EU has extended the term of existing copyrights. Last September, a fight being waged by Sir Cliff came to a conclusion as the term for existing recordings is extended to life plus 70. And the thing we need to recognize is that so long as this is the system of government we live within, they are always going to win this fight. And that begs a strategic choice by us. Should we be fighting for all or most in this fight? We can either be saying no to extensions, following Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, no to all extensions. Or we might be trying to say something a little bit different. What if we started saying, okay, extend if you pay. You want your copyright term extended, then go through a formality to extend it, at least to secure the extension. Buy it. Pay £100, £500, whatever the number is. Pay for it, and then let's use those monies to actually fund the arts, or the new artists who are said to be benefited by the extension of works that are more than 50 years old right now. Now, I think that it is a mistake for us to embrace the absolute position in the middle of this fight. It's a strategic mistake, because if we were to take the position of forcing them to pay for their extension, there would be an extension, there's going to be an extension anyway, but it would be an extension for 2% or 4% or 10% of creative works, not for 100%. And the extension would raise revenue for the rest of the arts in a way that could benefit arts generally. And it could begin to teach the lesson, which is we don't need this unambiguous perpetual copyright, even if we don't agree that they should have the ability to extend copyright forever. I think smart means making no such mistakes again. And then one final thing we need to do to be smart. We need to be wise. So wise in this sense. Henry David Thoreau wise. So Thoreau in 1846, while he was living at Walden Pond, wrote a book called On Walden. It wasn't a very creative title, but there it is, On Walden. And in this book, he has this wonderful passage. It says, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." Now that quote invites us to recognize, as we stand back and think about all the issues we care about, term extension, broadband, privacy, global warming legislation, in the United States healthcare system that works, a tax system not designed to raise money for campaigns as opposed to revenue for the government. All of these issues that we care about. And if we tie them together, connect the dots, I think in the United States, it's easy to say that there is a root to all of these problems. There is a root cause. In the United States, I want to say that root cause is a kind of corruption. It's not brown paper bag corruption, cash secreted among members of Congress, bribery. It's not the kind of corruption that Rob Blagojevich was found guilty of, using money to advance his personal gain. It's corruption relative to a certain ideal, a certain baseline, which is how our government was founded. So our government, when it was founded in 1787, called itself a republic, by which it meant a representative democracy. By representative democracy, what we meant, as Federalist 52 told us, was a government that would have a branch of the government which would be dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. You have the people, you have the government. I do my own slides. It's really cool the way that bounces like that, right? Okay, so the people and the government. It's this marionette relationship. All right, but here's the problem. Our Congress has allowed a different dependence to evolve, not just the dependence of the government upon the people, but increasingly a dependence of the government upon the funders of campaigns. Members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do that, they, like all of us, would develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their view in light of their understanding of what views will help raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then she went on to clarify, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone because, this might surprise you, the funders are not the people. 0.26% of Americans, 0.26, give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05 give the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01, the 1% of the 1%, give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. And 0.000063% have given 80% of the money in super PAC contributions in the presidential election so far. 196 Americans are responsible for 80% of the expenditures in the presidential cycle so far. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of the we are the 99%, really bad marketing, right? We are the 99.74%, or the 99.95%, or the 99.99%, or the 99.9999937%, depending upon your money, who don't have the influence that the other side has because they are not in the business of controlling the money. Now, this corruption has an effect. Number one, it leads Americans to believe, and I think Americans are right, it leads Americans to believe money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress, according to a poll we conducted. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we as Americans all believe: money buys results in Congress. Leading to number two, that belief erodes trust in the institution. Gallup last year said 11% of Americans had confidence in Congress. They then said the number was 12%. We're a little bit optimistic. But then the New York Times says it's now 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. In Britain, we should put this in context, right? There were certainly more Americans who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And that leads to number three. This low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote's an organization which registers and turns out young voters, and they turned out the largest number of young voters in the 2008 election, certainly guaranteeing the election for Barack Obama. In 2010, they found a significant number of their voters were not going to turn out to vote, so they said, why aren't you going to turn out? They conducted a poll. The number one answer by far, 2-1 over the second highest answer, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. Now, we in America have to find a way to end this, but the question is how? Now, in the United States, the Chhatarati are convinced that the really interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. But I submit the only interesting division in American politics and in world politics is between the inside and the outside. The inside, in the United States, the part inside the beltway of Washington, D.C., versus the outside. And if you look at what people on the inside talk about, it has very little connection to what people on the outside think about. So to borrow this title a little bit and remix it, Washington is from Mars and we are from Earth. The insiders and the outsiders are radically different. Now, the outsiders have a certain kind of politics. And we should learn because we're seeing it pop up everywhere again and again. It's a politics not of politicians. These are not people who want to become congressmen or senators. It's a kind of citizens' politics, citizens demanding that their politics change. And increasingly, we see these waves of, quote, open source energy, energy that describes itself as open source on the left and the right. So in America, in 1998, MoveOn is the beginning of this. MoveOn gets born when millions of Americans join a list to demand that Congress stop paying attention to the question whether Bill Clinton slept with an intern and start focusing on the questions of getting America to deal with the problems it faced. Millions of Americans were disgusted with that and joined together to make that demand, and that forced Congress to move the way they did. 2009, I think the Tea Party is another example of this. From the right, they describe themselves as an open source movement. 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement, again, describes itself as an open source movement, and most recently and most powerfully, SOPA in 2011 gets stopped by what is described as an open source movement. And it's not just the United States, of course. In Israel, in Spain, in France, and in Iceland, and most importantly in India, there is an increasing collection of powerful organizations that are building what we can think of as the international anti-corruption movement. Creative Commons were involved. This would be the logo for it, the AC movement. Okay. Now, you need to join that movement, this international anti-corruption movement, because until you do, this will continue to be the picture of policymaking that you confront. Now, I would never come here to ask you to give up your first love in your focus on privacy and copyright and building a free society online. I would never ask you to give that up. I don't want you to take this up as your first cause. But I want you to take this anti-corruption movement up as your second most important cause. Because the potential that we're seeing in these open source outsider movements is a potential that could actually change something here. I mean, think about what happened with SOPA. This was not just an American movement. It was a movement supported by people across the world, a coalition. People on the left and the right from across the world, hackers and activists and 21st century companies capped with the extraordinary intervention of Wikipedia, which in the United States shut down on January 18th to protest the potential passage of this law that would censor the internet. These groups represent who you are, and you beat them. Now, there's something extraordinary about that. I know people look to the Arab Spring and say there's something extraordinary about that, and I agree, there's something extraordinary. But you know, they're taking on freaks and dictators, people like this. But we took on Hollywood. We took on Hollywood, we took on all the money in the world, and you beat them. That is incredible. It is unimaginable, at least in this guy's head 14 years ago. I could not have conceived of it. Would have been impossible to imagine. But it's a product of this outsider energy constituted through hackers who are defining what activism could be that marks an extraordinary potential, a potential which Hobbes would have called the giant waking up. The giant. Right? The giant. Hobbes said, for most of the time, we the sovereign sleep. And then every once in a while, we are disturbed enough that we wake up. We, the outsiders, wake up. Now, we, the outsiders, know that we're actually a big friendly giant. We're not actually terrifying. But what the important point is to remember here is that this giant, in democracies, have all the power in the world. When we wake up, when we succeed in waking up, when these outsider movements can learn to coordinate enough to achieve a common end, we have all the power in the world. You need to help us to use that power to change not just a corrupt America, but a corrupt world. Thank you very much.